Right, hello everyone. First of all, I'm really sorry about this. I didn't know before half term that I was going to be having an operation this quickly, let alone that I wasn't going to be allowed in for 6 weeks afterwards. So it's not great. I'm really glad that Miss Atwell was able to take some of the lessons, but we'll try and make it work as best as possible. I think I'll try this with the videos. I know it's going to be awkward and you're going to be laughing at me at the moment, but I think it's the best way that I can do it. We're going to go through today the essay. Hopefully you've got your essay back now. If you haven't, these are the only ones I had. So if you haven't got it, please can you email me and let me know. But you'll still be able to do the things that I want you to do anyway, even if I haven't got your essay. If you have any problems, you can always email me. And if you do have work you need to give me, Mrs. Nichols is the best person, or Mrs. Nichols' daughter, the other Mrs. Nichols, because they live in my street. Right, as far as this essay goes, there were lots of really good stuff. I was really pleased, and we'll just go through it as we normally would have done. So the first thing is that the introduction on this was the most important thing, far more important, I would say, than any of the other essays that we've done. The definition of globally significant was key to this essay working. If you didn't make that clear straight away, it just you lost focus and lost structure. It meant later on, if you were talking about the EU being respected, you're thinking, well, what's that got to do with anything? You've got to link it being respected, if that's what you think is important, to global significance. Obviously, economic, military, soft power, these are all really important things. But you had to get a definition in there. Some of you didn't do it at all, and some of you seemed so keen to move on and get to the next thing that you missed out something that was really, really important. The other thing, again, I keep talking about putting something in current context. Now, I know this is probably since you've done the essay, but something perfect here would be about Greece looking like they want to leave the euro. How can it be significant if people want to leave? Or what it's doing with Russia and Ukraine, that a lot of what's happening there is going through the EU. So it obviously is significant. It doesn't really matter what your answer is, as always, but you just have to think something. Now, I'll put down some of the content on the sheet and hopefully you can go through that. But as far as the structure goes, I would have said for this a thematic approach would have worked really well. So having a paragraph on whether it's economically significant, a paragraph on whether it's militarily significant would have worked really well. Rather than just the individual news stories that I gave you, just focusing on them. I think it's really important as well that you think about getting your big points in early. I didn't necessarily see a lot of evidence of planning from some people. I think if the first point you're making is a bit of a weak one, it doesn't look well. And we've talked about this before, so please make your first point really, really important, really key. And then it just sets the examiner's mind at rest, makes them know that you know what is important. If you start with something that's fairly lightweight and warm up, it just doesn't sort of start off with a bang like you really want it to. There needs to be an argument running throughout this thing. You need to know what you think beforehand. There's no point in writing this question and deciding what you think as you go. Even in the exam, you've got to take a second and think, right, what do I think before you start writing? And that's where the planning comes important. Because some of you were saying, well, you could say this and you could say this, and then you never really concluded. You just laid out two sides. And for something that is analysis and explanation based, that's not going to work. So we need to have an argument running through. And there's a difference between argument and just laying out contradictory points. There was a number of you, and you know who you are, that I made comments about just giving contradictory viewpoints. You can't say in one paragraph, for example, that the EU are this huge military force because they've got nuclear weapons held in the EU and that they've done all this stuff outside of Europe and they're really, really important. Because I'm thinking, but they haven't got a unified military. That's one of the key things that people say is not good, that the hard power of the EU is really bad. And then in a completely separate paragraph say, however, you could also say that the EU is completely weak and has no hard power because, and go on to say that. If they're in two separate paragraphs, it's just contradictory. There's no argument there. You have to put those things together and have a mini conclusion. If that's the way you want to do it, if you're going to pick out things that are completely opposite to each other, you can't say them both. You've got to say that some people would say one, but this isn't true because, not just lay them together and not have anything pulling them together. So contradictory points can't happen. You can mention things that are contradictory, but you have to conclude, and you can't leave it to the end. The resources were provided for you for this. We went through in the lesson, and I think some of you, it was a perfect example of it, and this is relevant because Mr. Jolly told me it was. You had to be able to argue why these things linked to significance. Right? It wasn't just about writing the things that were in the news stories. It had to be more than that. And really, I would have liked to have seen some of you go and research your own things, and some of you did. But there was a lot that was just from the news stories. And considering I had given it to you, some of you didn't provide detail to back up your points, and that's not acceptable. You've got to get into the habit of doing that. Now, another thing that I think was really good that many of you started doing with this is comparing. If we're talking about whether something is significant or not, you were comparing it to other bodies. So is it as significant as NATO? Is it as significant on the world stage as the USA or China? It doesn't matter what you think, but if we're talking about how significant something is, then putting it in against others would be a really good way of doing that. Just a couple of points quickly to pull up on, I'll go soon, I promise, is that saying that the EU is really important because it has nuclear weapons, I'm not really happy with that. Because the EU doesn't have nuclear weapons. The United Kingdom do, France do, and there's 3 sharing states. But the 3 sharing states only have the nuclear weapons because they're members of NATO. That's the point. So maybe NATO is more important. And the UK and France would never use the nuclear weapons on behalf of the EU. They would only use them for themselves. So you can't make that as a point. I think talking about the EU being really important because it's represented twice on the P5, again, exactly the same. Would the United Kingdom use a veto in the P5 on behalf of the EU? No, because actually both of these things support the view that states are the most important, the state-centric view of politics that I know you've been talking about with Mrs. Binns. So just think about what you're saying. Really think about what points you're making and whether it's true before you write it down. Some of you managed to write essays about the EU without ever mentioning the word Germany at all, and I think just to focus on the news stories because they were there, or focus on the UK. Germany's such an important part of the EU that how important Germany is as a country, the P5+1, you have